How could 4,000 men disappear into a river valley in a single day? Picture this. Along a narrow stretch of marshland in northern Germany, archaeologists have uncovered 12,500 bone fragments belonging to at least 150 young warriors, all killed around 1250 BCE in what may be Europe's oldest and most brutal battlefield. But here's the twist that sends chills down your spine. 27% of these men had healed wounds from previous battles, meaning they were professional fighters, seasoned warriors who had survived combat before. Yet not one of them survived Tollense Valley. The bodies were stripped of valuables, thrown into shallow ponds, and left to rot in the swamp. This wasn't just a battle. This was systematic slaughter on a scale Bronze Age Europe had never seen before. And the evidence suggests something even darker. These warriors may have been ambushed at a critical river crossing, trapped between marshland and enemies who showed no mercy. The Tolens Valley sits approximately 140 kilometers north of modern Berlin, in the heart of Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania. In 1250 BCE, this landscape looked nothing like today's peaceful farmland. Imagine instead a vast wetland dominated by thick reed beds, open water surfaces, and a shallow but wide river meandering through treacherous marsh. The valley itself was only 50 meters wide in some spots, creating a natural bottleneck that any traveler would have to navigate carefully. Then Bronze Age Northern Europe was sparsely populated, with population density estimated at just 3 to 5 people per square kilometer. There were no towns, no villages, just scattered farmsteads where extended families eked out an existence. The nearest large settlement was over 350 kilometers away. This isolation made the Tolens Valley strategically critical for one simple reason. It was one of the few places where you could cross the valley and continue your journey, whether you were trading, raiding, or migrating. Sometime around 1750, i.e., 5 centuries before the massacre, someone had constructed a causeway across the valley, a 120-meter-long bridge made of timbers, sand, and turf. This causeway transformed Tolens from a natural barrier into a trade route, a crossroads where valuable goods and the people who carried them would have to pass. But crossing points are also killing points, just as the Teutoburg forest would become Rome's graveyard 1,200 years later. Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Dorians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed by the Mycenaean palaces of Greece were collapsing. When the mysterious sea peoples were beginning their destructive migrations. When trade networks that had functioned for centuries were fracturing. In Germany and Central Europe, burial practices were changing radically. The traditional individual burials were giving way to the urn-field culture, where cremated remains were placed in urns and buried in vast cemeteries. This wasn't just a change in funeral customs. It reflected profound transformations in social organization, power structures, and probably warfare itself. New research has revealed that bronze arrowheads were becoming widespread across southern Germany during this period, suggesting that armed conflict was intensifying throughout Central Europe. Now, warriors were emerging as a distinct social class, no longer just farmers who picked up weapons when needed, but professional fighters who trained for combat and bore the scars to prove it. Into this volatile world came two forces that would collide at Tolens with devastating consequences. On one side, we have evidence of local warriors from Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania, men who used flint arrowheads and wooden clubs alongside some bronze weapons. Point. On the other side, forensic point. On the other side, forensic analysis of 54 bronze and flint arrowheads found embedded in bones and scattered across the battlefield tells a darker story. Many of these arrowheads don't match local styles at all. Instead, they're identical to arrowheads from regions 400 kilometers to the south, from what is now Bavaria, Moravia, and parts of Austria. While some arrowheads show characteristics of weapons from Scandinavia. This wasn't a local dispute between neighboring clans. This was an interregional conflict involving warriors who had traveled hundreds of kilometers, possibly as an organized army, possibly as hired mercenaries, possibly as an invading force bent on seizing control of valuable trade routes. In the summer of 1250 BCE, something happened that would turn the Tolens causeway red with blood. We don't know the exact trigger, but we can reconstruct the horror that unfolded with forensic precision thanks to the waterlogged conditions that preserved the evidence. An amateur archaeologist discovered the first clue in 1996 when he noticed a single bone protruding from the riverbank. It was a humerus, an upper arm bone, and wedged firmly into one end was a flint arrowhead that had been driven into the bone with such force that 3,250 years later it was still embedded in place. That single find sparked decades of excavation, and what archaeologists uncovered was beyond anything they had imagined possible for Bronze Age Europe. Along a 3-kilometer stretch of the river, they found hundreds upon hundreds of bones. A 73-centimeter wooden club resembling a baseball bat, its surface battered from repeated impacts against human skulls. Bronze spearheads designed to punch through flesh and shatter bone. Swords, knives, sickles repurposed as weapons, and arrowheads. And so many arrowheads, more than 50 bronze specimens alone, with countless flint points scattered through the kill zone. The bodies began to tell their stories under the scrutiny of forensic anthropologist Ute Brinker. These weren't elderly men or children caught in the crossfire. These were young adults, almost all between 20 and 40 years old, in their physical prime. Out of 130 individuals identified so far, the overwhelming majority were male warriors. 27% of them bore healed fractures and wounds from earlier battles, including 3 skulls with healed traumas that had knitted back together over months or years. These men had fought before. They knew the terror of combat. They had survived previous encounters, but not this one. One skull shows clear evidence of blunt force trauma, probably from one of those wooden clubs, the blow so powerful it caved in the bone. Another skull has a bronze arrowhead still lodged inside it. The projectile having pierced through the skull and lodged in the brain, death would have been instantaneous. But many died far more slowly. Brinker picks up a rib in the forensic laboratory, pointing to 2 tiny V-shaped cuts on one edge. This warrior was stabbed twice in the same place, probably as he lay wounded on the ground. They found many ribs like this, often with multiple stab marks showing that attackers moved through the battlefield, finishing off the wounded. The isotopic analysis revealed something even more chilling. These men came from all over Central Europe. Some had spent their childhoods hundreds of kilometers away, in regions near modern Poland, in the Netherlands, even from distant Scandinavia. They weren't all locals defending their homeland, and they weren't all invaders from one unified army. The genetic and isotopic signatures show a mixture, suggesting a more complex scenario than a simple us versus them battle. And some researchers now believe that what happened at Tolens was an ambush, a massacre of a trade caravan that had armed guards but was overwhelmed by a larger, better organized force. Picture a column of merchants and their protectors approaching the causeway, perhaps carrying valuable bronze goods, tin items that were worth their weight in gold in this period, and other trade goods. They would have had no choice but to cross at this narrow point. The wetlands on either side were impassable, yet the reeds thick enough to hide dozens of warriors waiting in ambush. What happened next was systematic slaughter. The battle unfolded with the kind of close-quarters brutality that would shock even modern soldiers. Evidence from the bones shows fighting at multiple ranges. Some men were killed by arrows shot from distance, the projectiles arcing through the air to strike unprotected backs, legs, and heads. The placement of arrow wounds is revealing. Many struck from behind, suggesting warriors were fleeing, running through the marsh trying to escape the killing zone when arrowheads found them. Shields may have protected fighters from frontal attacks, but once men turned to run, their backs were exposed. One warrior took an arrow to the pelvis, a wound that would have crippled him instantly, leaving him helpless on the muddy ground. Others died in hand-to-hand combat, their bones showing defensive wounds on arms raised to ward off blows, ribs punctured by thrusting spears, skulls fractured by clubs swung with murderous force. The diamond-shaped holes in some bones match perfectly with the distinctive shapes of bronze arrowheads found scattered across the site. Forensic anthropologists have even recreated the specific angles of impact, showing that some men were struck down while mounted on horses, shot from below by archers on foot. At least 5 horses died at Tolens, their bones mixed with the human remains. And the presence of these horses tells us something crucial. This wasn't just a rabble of farmers with sharp sticks. Someone at this battle commanded mounted warriors, an elite class of bronze-wielding cavalry that rode into combat while common soldiers fought on foot with simpler weapons. Standardized metal weaponry, found intermingled with horse bones, confirms the existence of a warrior aristocracy. in officers who could afford expensive bronze weapons and the precious horses to carry them into battle. But even these elite warriors died. Even their expensive bronze swords and spearheads couldn't save them once the battle turned into a rout. Forensic reconstructions have shown that some of the most devastating wounds came from bronze spearheads driven downward with such force that they split femurs lengthwise, like firewood. One experimental archaeologist tested this by thrusting recreated Bronze Age spearheads into dead pigs to replicate the damage. The results were horrifying. An average-sized man using his body weight behind the thrust could drive a bronze spearhead completely through a leg bone, shattering it with a sound that survivors would have heard echoing across the valley, mixed with the screams of the dying. The killing went on for hours, perhaps even an entire day. In one concentrated area of just 12 square meters, archaeologists found 1,478 bones, including 20 skulls, all jumbled together by the motion of water. This suggests bodies were falling or being thrown into shallow ponds where currents mixed the remains of dozens of men. The fact that remains are no longer in anatomical connection, meaning skulls separated from spines, leg bones scattered from pelvis, tells us the victors engaged in systematic looting after the battle. They stripped the dead of anything valuable: bronze weapons, jewelry, clothing, armor, if any existed. What they left were naked corpses tossed into the river to drift downstream and settle in calmer water. But here's what makes this even darker. They didn't bury their own dead either. If this had been a typical battle where both sides fought to stand still and then withdrew, we would expect to find evidence of burial rituals, bodies arranged with care. Instead, the archaeological evidence suggests the victors simply left, abandoning hundreds of corpses to rot in the summer heat. Only 2 gold spiral rings were ever found at the site, discovered by metal detectorists in 2010 and 2011. Each about 3 centimeters long and weighing just 10 grams. But here's the truly remarkable find. 2 small items identified by X-ray diffraction as pure tin. The oldest known tin objects ever discovered in Germany. Tin was the critical ingredient in bronze making, transported along trade routes from distant mines. The presence of these tin items, so rare and valuable that the next similar find in Central Europe dates 600 years later, strongly suggests that whoever died at Tolens was protecting or carrying valuable trade goods. As the sun set on that day in 1250 BCE, the Tolens Valley had been transformed into a charnel house. Bodies floated in the ponds and shallow streams. Blood darkened the water. The victors had stripped the dead and vanished, leaving no trace of who they were or where they went. But the landscape itself preserved their crime. The wetland conditions, the peat that gradually covered the bodies, the chemistry of the soil, all conspired to mummify the evidence of this massacre in near-perfect condition. The bones that forensic anthropologists analyze today in climate-controlled laboratories look as though the warriors died just decades ago, not over 3 millennia. You can still see the cut marks where bronze knives finished off wounded men. You can still see the fracture patterns where clubs caved in skulls. You can still see the arrowheads lodged in bones, each one a frozen moment of violent death. The scale of what happened at Tolens only becomes apparent when you do the math. Archaeologists have excavated approximately 460 square meters of the battlefield as of 2017, and that represents perhaps 3 to 10% of the total area where remains are buried. If the density of bodies remains consistent throughout the site, we're looking at potentially 750 to 1,300 dead. But the original battle involved far more than just the dead. Modern military historians estimate that for every fatality in pre-modern warfare, there were typically 3 to 5 wounded who survived. If 750 died at Tolens, the total number of casualties, dead and wounded combined, could have approached 3,000 to 4,000 individuals. That means the original estimates of 4,000 warriors fighting at this location may not have been exaggerations at all. This would have represented a significant fraction of the entire regional population. Remember, population density was only 3 to 5 people per square kilometer. To assemble even 2,000 warriors on each side would have required mobilizing men from across hundreds of square kilometers, stripping farmsteads of their adult males, and leaving women, children, and the elderly to maintain the settlements. What could possibly justify such a massive mobilization in an era we assumed was relatively peaceful? The answer lies in what was at stake. The 13th century BCE was a period of climate stress across Europe and the Mediterranean. Crops were failing. Trade networks were fracturing. Competition for resources was intensifying. Whoever controlled the Tolens crossing controlled movement through northern Germany. He controlled access to trade routes connecting Scandinavia with Central Europe, controlled the flow of tin, amber, copper, and other valuable commodities. Some researchers now believe the battle might have been triggered by a trade caravan carrying particularly valuable goods, perhaps a large shipment of tin or bronze weapons, protected by armed guards but still vulnerable to a well-planned ambush. Others think it might have been part of a larger territorial war, with southern armies pushing north to secure new lands and resources, meeting resistance from locals determined to defend their crossing point. The typological analysis of those 54 arrowheads provides a crucial clue. The southern-style arrowheads aren't just a few random examples. They represent a significant proportion of the total, suggesting an organized force from Bavaria or Moravia made the long march north specifically to fight at this location. But why leave so many dead unburied? Well, why loot the bodies, but not take time to honor your own fallen? One chilling explanation: there were no victors dead to bury. If this was indeed an ambush, a massacre of a trade caravan trapped at a river crossing, then casualties might have been extremely one-sided. The ambushers, using the terrain and the element of surprise, could have inflicted catastrophic losses while suffering relatively few themselves. After stripping the dead of valuables, they simply withdrew, leaving the corpses for scavengers. Another possibility, equally dark. The battle was so brutal, so total, that even the victors were too traumatized or exhausted to deal with the dead. They won the field, but at such cost that they lacked the manpower or willpower to dispose of hundreds of bodies. They left them rotting where they fell. A grim warning to anyone else who might challenge their control of the crossing. The aftermath of Tolens would have rippled across Bronze Age Europe for years. A battle that claimed 750 to 1,300 lives in a single day would have depopulated entire regions. Farmsteads across hundreds of square kilometers would have lost their adult males, their defenders, their primary laborers. Women and children would have faced the following winter without enough hands to bring in the harvest, without warriors to protect against raiders, without the strong backs needed for heavy farm work. Villages that sent 20 men to Tolens might have seen only 1 or 2 return, if any. The demographic impact would have been catastrophic, a Bronze Age echo of what World War I did to entire European villages in 1914 to 1918. But unlike the Great War, there were no monuments built for these dead, no named graves, no commemoration. Their bones lay forgotten under meters of peat for 3,250 years until an amateur archaeologist's lucky find brought their story back to light. We don't know the names of the commanders who led them. We don't know which side won in any meaningful sense. We don't even know for certain whether this was a battle between equals or a massacre of the defenseless. What we do know is that it changed everything. The Tolens Valley Massacre forced archaeologists to completely revise their understanding of Bronze Age warfare. For decades, Scholars had argued that large-scale organized violence was rare in prehistoric Europe, or that conflicts were small tribal skirmishes involving dozens of fighters at most. The discovery of mass graves and fortified settlements had suggested some level of warfare, but nothing like what the evidence at Tolens revealed. Here was proof positive that Bronze Age societies could mobilize thousands of warriors, march them hundreds of kilometers, equip them with standardized weapons, organize them under professional commanders, and deploy them in coordinated military operations. These weren't farmer soldiers grabbing pitchforks when raiders appeared. These were professional warriors, men whose bodies showed evidence of years of training and previous combat experience. The presence of mounted cavalry, bronze weapons, and evidence of tactical planning all point to a level of military sophistication that historians previously thought impossible for this era. Thomas Terburger, one of the lead archaeologists on the Tolens excavations, had put it bluntly: this new information has considerably changed the image of the Bronze Age, which was not as peaceful as believed before. But Tolens also revealed something darker about human nature. This wasn't noble combat between equals who respected each other even in death. This was slaughter followed by systematic looting, bodies stripped and discarded like garbage. The wounded finished off with stabbing attacks as they lay helpless. The archaeological evidence shows a level of brutality and disregard for the dead that speaks to either intense hatred between the combatants or a complete breakdown of any warrior code that might have previously restrained violence. When you stab a wounded man twice in the same spot, when you bash in his skull with a club after he's already down, when you leave hundreds of bodies to rot without burial, you're making a statement about how little those lives mattered to you. The victors of Tolens didn't just win a battle. They sent a message written in broken bones and unburied corpses. This is what happens when you oppose us. This is the fate of anyone who tries to cross this valley without our permission. This is the price of defiance. The Tolens Valley Massacre stands as Europe's oldest known battlefield. But Thomas Terburger believes it's probably just the tip of the iceberg. The 13th century BCE saw a wave of fortification building across Central Europe, with hill forts springing up in regions that had never needed them before. Someone was building defenses against someone else, and those defenses weren't symbolic. They were serious military installations designed to withstand sieges and assaults. The widespread distribution of bronze arrowheads across southern Germany during this period suggests that archery had become a critical battlefield weapon, that warriors were training specifically in the use of bows to kill other men at distance. The shift from individual burials to urnfield cremation burials might reflect a society that was producing so many war dead that individual treatment became impossible or impractical. When you're cremating dozens or hundreds of bodies at once and storing them in urns, you're dealing with casualty rates that suggest frequent, large-scale warfare. Tolens gives us one frozen moment in this violent transformation, one day when the violence boiled over into massacre. But the evidence suggests it was far from unique. This victory, or more accurately, this massacre, achieved something that no other Bronze Age event had managed. It left physical evidence so overwhelming that 3,250 years later, we can reconstruct what happened with forensic precision. If the ambushers had lost at Tolens, if the trade caravan had fought them off, or if local defenders had held the causeway, the history of Northern Europe might have followed a very different path. Whoever controlled the Tolens crossing controlled a critical trade route. Lose that crossing, and you lose access to Scandinavian amber, Baltic goods, the entire network of exchange that kept Bronze Age economies functioning. The massacre may have shifted the balance of power across an entire region, allowing one group to dominate trade and extract tribute from anyone who wanted to use that route. Or it may have been a Pyrrhic victory that left both sides so depleted that neither could effectively control the area afterward. opening it up to exploitation by third parties who had stayed out of the fighting. We'll never know for certain because there are no written records, no chroniclers to tell us who won and what happened next. But the silence itself is telling. Bronze Age societies didn't build monuments to defeats. They didn't memorialize their massacres, but they buried the evidence and moved on, leaving only the bones in the mud to tell the story. What makes Tolens truly significant is what would have been lost if the ambush had succeeded completely. If every single warrior had been killed with no survivors to carry word back to their home settlements. Knowledge would have died. Valuable trade goods would have been stolen. An entire generation of warriors, men who had trained for years and fought in multiple battles, would have been eliminated, as the communities they came from would have been left defenseless, vulnerable to raids and conquest. Bronze Age society was fragile in ways we can barely imagine. There were no standing armies to conscript, no reserve forces to call up, no military academies to train new officers. If you lost your warriors, it took a generation to replace them, 20 years before the boys were old enough to fight effectively. The massacre at Tolens may have crippled entire societies for decades, leaving them unable to defend their lands or participate in the trade networks that sustained Bronze Age civilization. And if the victors went on to exploit their victory, to extract tribute and control the crossing permanently, they could have shaped the development of Northern European society for centuries afterward. We credit the Germanic tribes who later emerged from this region. But the genetic and cultural roots of those tribes may trace back to whoever triumphed at Tolens and used that victory to establish dominance over trade and territory. Today, if you visit the Tolens Valley, you'll find peaceful farmland with no obvious signs of the horror that unfolded there. The river still meanders through the valley much as it did in 1250 BCE, though the wetlands have been drained and the causeway has long since vanished. There are no monuments, no markers, just fields where farmers grow crops unaware that beneath their plows lie the remains of Bronze Age warriors. In the laboratories and storage facilities where the bones are kept, researchers continue to analyze the evidence, extracting DNA, measuring isotopes, cataloging injuries, slowly piecing together a more complete picture of what happened that day. Every new arrowhead analyzed, every bone scanned with electron microscopy, and every isotope ratio calculated adds another detail to our understanding. But some questions will never be answered. We'll never know the names of the men who died there. We'll never hear their voices or understand what they thought as they approached that fatal crossing. We'll never know if they died defending their homeland or if they were part of an invading force that met unexpected resistance. All we have are their bones, stripped of flesh and identity, here reduced to forensic specimens that tell us how they died, but not who they were or why they fought. The legacy of Tolens is written in academic papers and museum displays, in the countless studies that cite it as proof that Bronze Age warfare was far more sophisticated and brutal than anyone had imagined. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about our capacity for organized violence, even in societies we thought were relatively primitive and peaceful. The warriors who died at Tolens were not so different from us. They were young men in their prime, skilled at their craft, survivors of previous battles who thought they'd live to fight again. They were wrong. The Tolens Valley swallowed them all, and for 3,250 years their bones waited in the mud, preserved by the same wetland that witnessed their deaths, until finally, archaeologists brought them back into the light and gave their story back to the world. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive into one of history's darkest archaeological discoveries. If this story of Bronze Age brutality fascinated you as much as it did me, please hit that like button and let's try to reach 1,000 likes in the next 24 hours. Subscribe for more content, exploring the violent and often forgotten chapters of human history that archaeology continues to uncover. Drop a comment below telling me what historical battle or massacre you'd like me to cover next. Should we explore another Bronze Age conflict? Maybe jump forward to the Iron Age massacres? Or should we cross over to another continent entirely and look at ancient warfare in Asia or the Americas? Your suggestions drive this channel's content. So let me know what dark corners of history you want illuminated. Until next time, remember that beneath our feet lies evidence of countless struggles, massacres, and battles that shape the world we live in today. The past is never really past. No, it's just buried, waiting to be rediscovered.